sons didn't come when the paramedics called. They didn't come when the hospital called twice more. And when the doctor finally reached my daughter-in-law, she said, "He's been sick before. He'll be fine." I lay in that ICU bed for 4 days alone, while my 2 boys, the ones I'd worked 37 years to provide for, went about their lives like I was already gone. Then, on the 5th day, they showed up. Not with flowers, not with apologies, with questions about the house, but my attorney had already been there, and when they found out what I'd done, the colour left their faces like someone had pulled a plug. They were certain they had me cornered. They were wrong. Before I go on, I want to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and state in the comments. It means more than you know. The stroke hit on a Wednesday morning in October. I remember because I'd just poured my second cup of coffee and was standing at the kitchen window watching the maple in the backyard. The leaves were turning, the deep reds and oranges that Margaret always loved. She used to drag me outside every fall just to stand under that tree and look up. I'd complained about the cold every single time. I'd give anything to complain about it with her now. One moment I was holding that mug. The next, my right hand went numb and the mug was on the floor, and I was sliding down the cabinet with no idea how I got there. The room tilted sideways. I tried to call out, but the words wouldn't come, just a sound I didn't recognize as my own voice. My neighbour Patsy found me. She'd seen my car in the driveway all morning and knew I had a doctor's appointment I'd never miss. She has a key for exactly that reason. She called 911 and held my hand on the kitchen floor until the ambulance came, talking to me the whole time, telling me I was going to be fine. Her voice steady even though I could see in her eyes she wasn't sure. I was 68 years old, a retired high school principal from Augusta, Georgia, and I was being loaded into an ambulance while my neighbour held my hand. Not my son's, my neighbour. The hospital contacted my older son Franklin first. He's 42, lives 40 minutes away in Savannah. The nurse told me later he said he was in a meeting and would try to get there when he could. He didn't come that day. He didn't come the next. My youngest son Curtis lives in Charleston. He's 39. When the hospital called him, his wife Deborah answered instead. She told them I'd had scares before and I was strong. She said they'd check in by phone. They didn't call. 4 days in the ICU. A blood clot had formed, pressing against the left side of my brain. The neurologist, a young woman named Dr. Marga Okafor, was direct with me once I was stable enough to understand her. She said I was lucky. She said if Patsy hadn't found me when she did, we'd be having a very different conversation, or no conversation at all. I asked about my sons. She adjusted her pen in her coat pocket and said very carefully that they had been notified multiple times. I didn't say anything for a long time after that. I stared at the ceiling, at the white tiles and the fluorescent hum, and I thought about Franklin at age 7, sick with the flu. How I'd sat on the edge of his bed for 2 nights reading him whatever book he wanted, over and over, until his fever broke. I thought about Curtis at 16, wrecking my truck on a back road outside town. I'd driven out at midnight in the rain to get him, never once raised my voice, just put my arm around him and said we'd figure it out. We always figured it out. I always figured it out. I always figured it out. They'd told the hospital I was his problem. No, they hadn't used those words exactly, but they hadn't come. And in my experience, after nearly 40 years of watching people, students, parents, teachers, human beings under pressure, what people do tells you everything. Words are cheap. Where you are when it matters is the truth. My right hand had been weak for 3 days. My speech was slow, like the words had to travel a longer road to get out. The therapist said it would improve. Dr. Okafor said the next few weeks were critical. I nodded at all of it, but underneath the medical information, something had shifted in me, something quiet and final, the way a door closes, not with a slam, but with a soft click that somehow sounds more permanent. On the 5th day, they came. Franklin walked in first. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled, like he'd driven straight from somewhere else. He started to say something about the traffic from Savannah, and I watched his mouth move and felt nothing that resembled the relief I should have felt seeing my son. Curtis came in behind him and Deborah hovered in the doorway with a look I'd seen before on people who wanted to appear concerned without committing to it. They asked how I was feeling. I said I was improving. Ben Franklin sat down and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the same posture he'd used since he was a teenager when he wanted something, and said he and Curtis had been talking. He said they were concerned about me living alone. He said the house was a lot to manage. He said they'd been thinking it might be time to consider my options. Options, I repeated. Curtis jumped in then, softer, more careful. He said they weren't trying to push anything. They just wanted what was best for me. He mentioned that a place in the house could net a lot in the current market. He mentioned that there were assisted living facilities nearby that were really very nice. Deborah nodded from the doorway. I looked at my younger son and then at my older son, and I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she and I had bought that house in 1989 for $92,000. How we'd repainted every room ourselves over 3 weekends. How she planted that maple in the backyard herself 6 years before the boys were born, so it would be big enough to climb by the time we had children. How she'd sat under it every fall until she got sick. How she'd made me promise in the last week of her life that I'd keep it. That was the house they wanted to sell. I asked them, my voice still slower than I wanted it, if they had come to see me or to see what I owned. The room got very quiet. Franklin said that wasn't fair. Curtis looked at the floor. Deborah disappeared into the hallway. I told them I was tired and needed to rest. I told them we'd talk more when I was discharged. They left with the tight, uncomfortable smiles of people who believe they've already won and just need to wait. That night, after the nurse had dimmed the lights and the floor had gotten quiet, I lay there with my left hand resting on the blanket and I thought about letting go, not of the house, of everything. Of the exhausting, grinding effort of being alive when the people you'd lived for had made it so clear they saw you as a burden and a bank account. I was 68. My right side was weak. My wife was gone. My neighbour was the person who'd saved my life. What exactly was I fighting for? I turned my head and looked at the small table by the bed. My watch was there. The watch Margaret had given me on our 30th anniversary. It was nothing fancy. Just a silver Seiko with a plain face and an engraving on the back. Every morning, always, M. She'd said that was her promise. Every morning, she'd be glad she married me. She'd kept it until she couldn't anymore. I picked it up with my left hand and held it. And I thought about the version of myself that had built something from nothing. My father had been a janitor. My mother had cleaned houses. I was the first in my family to finish college, the first to get a master's degree, the first to run a school. I'd done all of it while raising 2 boys and loving 1 woman and never once asking anyone to carry me. That man wasn't done. I set the watch back down. I reached for my phone. My attorney, a man named Howard, had been my friend since we'd coached youth baseball together in the late 90s. He answered on the 3rd ring. And I could hear the television in the background, some game he'd been watching. I told him I was sorry for the late hour. He said to forget it. I said I needed to talk. He muted the game. I told him everything, about the 4 days, about the phone calls the hospital had made, about my sons and their conversation about my options. Howard was quiet for most of it, the kind of quiet that means a person is thinking hard. Then he said, "James, what do you want to do?" I told him. He said, "Okay, I'll be there tomorrow." He was there by 10 in the morning. We talked for 2 hours. He had a notary with him, a woman who sat in the corner and witnessed what needed to be witnessed and said nothing except what was required of her professionally. Howard had drafted the new documents the night before, working from what I'd told him. He showed me everything line by line. I signed with my left hand. It took longer than usual. I didn't mind. When Howard left, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Not even relief exactly. It was more like clarity, like the fog that had been sitting over everything for years had finally lifted and I could see the shape of the land. 2 days later, Dr. Okafor cleared me for discharge. My speech was coming back steadily. My right hand still felt like it was wearing a thick glove, but the therapist said another few weeks would make a significant difference. Patsy was coming to pick me up. That morning, before I changed into my street clothes, I sat on the edge of the bed and wrote 2 letters. One to Franklin, one to Curtis. I wrote them separately because they had made themselves separate. 2 grown men who shared a last name and a childhood and had somehow arrived at the same failure of character through different paths. I wrote what I needed to say, not cruelty. I wasn't capable of cruelty toward them, even now. And I knew it. But truth. The kind of truth that doesn't apologize for itself. I sealed each letter in an envelope and wrote their names on the front in the slow, deliberate handwriting that was all I could manage. I handed them to the nurse at the desk and asked her to give them to my sons when they came. I told her they would come. She looked at me with a kind of careful expression and said she'd make sure of it. I walked out of Augusta General with Patsy holding my left arm, and I didn't look back. The drive home took 20 minutes. The maple was still full of colour. Patsy had put a pot of soup on my stove the day before and left the key on the counter. She'd stocked the refrigerator and put fresh towels in the bathroom. She'd done all of this without being asked, without expectation, without an angle. That's what I thought about on the drive home. Not my sons, but Patsy, who had lived next door for 11 years and had never once treated me like a problem to be solved. I was inside for about an hour when my phone rang. Franklin. Dad. His voice was tight the way it got when he was trying to control something. I just read your letter. Can you explain what this means exactly? It wasn't a question. It was the tone of a man who had expected a different outcome and was demanding a correction. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one that faced the backyard, and I could see the maple from where I sat. I said, I think the letter's pretty clear, Franklin. You're giving away the house. You're giving away everything. I'm deciding what happens to what I built, I said. That's my right. You had a stroke, he said. You're not thinking straight. Howard should have known better than to. I was declared competent by 2 physicians before those documents were signed, I said. Howard made sure of that. Specifically because I knew someone might say exactly what you just said. Silence. Then Curtis's voice joined the call. They'd been on together. Of course they had. Dad, please, Curtis said, and his voice cracked a little, which surprised me. Or maybe it didn't. Curtis had always been better at performing emotion than Franklin. We made a mistake. We know that. We should have come. We were scared, okay? We didn't know how bad it was. The hospital called you 4 times, I said. I know. Dr. Perticles. Okafor told your brother directly that I might not make it. I know, Dad. Then don't tell me you didn't know how bad it was, I said. Tell me the truth, if you still remember how. Another silence, longer this time. Deborah's voice came on, smoother than either of theirs. She said she understood that I was upset. She said this wasn't what any of them wanted. She said family was everything and that we could work through this together. She said the word together, like it was a tool she'd just picked up and was testing for the first time. Deborah, I said, you told the hospital I'd been sick before and I'd be fine. 4 times they called. You answered once, and you sent them away. She didn't say anything. I want you to think about what would have happened if Patsy hadn't had a key, I said. I want you to really sit with that. I ended the call. My hands were trembling slightly, the right one more than the left, still, but both of them shaking. I set the phone down on the side table next to Margaret's photo, the one from our trip to Asheville the summer before she got sick. She was laughing in it, her head thrown back, the mountains behind her. I picked it up and just held it for a minute. She would have come. If it had been me getting that call, I would have been in the car before I'd hung up the phone. We were that for each other, and I'd believed for 40 years of raising those boys that I'd given them enough of that, enough of watching us love each other and show up for each other, that some of it would stick. It hadn't, and maybe I needed to stop asking why, because the answer didn't change anything and spend my energy on what did. Howard called that afternoon to check in. I told him about the phone calls. He said the documents were solid, that a competency challenge would go nowhere given the medical documentation. He told me the trust had been established exactly as we'd discussed. The house would transfer to the Margaretha Foundation, named for my wife, spelled the way her mother had spelled it, with the extra E at the end, that Margaret herself had quietly dropped in elementary school because kids made fun of it. The foundation's purpose was simple: fund college scholarships for first-generation students in the Augusta area. Kids whose parents hadn't gone to college. Kids like me, like my mother, like my father, who had mopped floors in a building full of people who had opportunities he never got. The house, the one my sons had wanted to sell, would be converted into the foundation's home base. A place where scholarship recipients could come for mentoring and support, where the maple in the backyard would keep turning red and orange every October, the way Margaret had always loved. Howard said, "You sure about this, James?" I looked out at the backyard. The afternoon light was coming through the branches at a low angle, the way it does in late October in Georgia, golden and a little thin. I could almost see her standing there looking up. "More sure than I've been about anything in years," I said. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Franklin called twice more, both times with a different approach. First more legal threats, which Howard had already told me weren't viable, and then something that was almost, but not quite, an apology. He said he regretted not being there. He said things had been complicated. He didn't say what things. I told him I appreciated him saying that and that I wished him well. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd been expecting a fight or a forgiveness, and I wasn't offering either. Curtis came to the door one Saturday morning unannounced. I saw his car in the driveway from the upstairs window, and I sat with it for a moment before going down. He looked different standing on my porch. Smaller, maybe. Or just more honest, the performance stripped away. I opened the door. He said, "I just wanted to see you." I said, "Come in." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd had my second cup of coffee on the morning of the stroke, and I made us both coffee because that's what you do. Curtis wrapped his hands around the mug and stared at it and didn't say anything for a while. I waited. I'd spent 37 years in schools learning how to wait for people to say the real thing. Finally, he said, "I don't have an excuse." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't even know who I've become. I look at what Deb and I did, what we didn't do, and I don't recognize myself." I said, "That might be the most honest thing you've said to me in 10 years. His jaw tightened. He wasn't angry. He was ashamed, which is harder. I told him I wasn't going to reverse what I'd done. The foundation was established. The house had a purpose. He nodded like he'd expected that. I told him that what happened between us as father and son was a different question than what happened with the estate, that those were two separate things, and I refused to let the money be what decided whether we had any relationship at all. I told him that I still loved him, that I would always love him, but love wasn't the same as trust, and trust was going to take time, and I was 68 years old and I was not willing to spend whatever time I had left pretending. He cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, looking down at the coffee mug, his shoulders moving. I sat there with him. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't, not yet. But I handed him a napkin from the holder on the table, and I let him sit there as long as he needed. That afternoon, after he'd gone, I put on a jacket and went out to the backyard. The maple had started dropping leaves, the ground underneath it patchy with colour. I stood under it for a while, my hands in my pockets, my right hand still not quite right, but getting closer every day. The neighbourhood was quiet. Somebody down the street was raking. Somewhere close, a dog barked once and then stopped. Patsy leaned over the fence from her yard. She had her garden gloves on. She looked at me and said, "How you doing, James?" I thought about it. I thought about the ICU and the 4 days and the letters I'd written and the foundation bearing Margaret's name and Curtis at my kitchen table crying into his coffee and the maple dropping its leaves the way it did every year, the way it had done since before my sons were born. "Better," I said. And I meant it. She nodded, like that was enough, which it was, and went back to her garden. I stood under that tree a while longer. I wasn't thinking about Franklin's legal threats or Deborah's smooth, empty words, or any of it. I was thinking about a group of kids somewhere in Augusta who would go to college because of a house and a maple tree, and a woman named Margaret who had planted it 40 years ago because she believed in building things that outlasted you. That was the inheritance I was leaving. I pulled my jacket tighter against the October air and stayed under the tree until the light was almost gone, the way Margaret used to make me do. This time I didn't complain about the cold. I keep coming back to that maple tree. Margaret planted it before we even had children, because she said she wanted to build something that would be there when it mattered. She didn't plant it for herself. She planted it for herself. She planted it for a future she couldn't fully see yet. That's the kind of person she was. And standing under it after everything that happened, I realized that the whole story, the stroke, the silence, the letters, the foundation, all of it came down to one simple truth. What you build and why you build it eventually tells the whole truth about who you are. Franklin and Curtis had grown up watching me work. They saw the long hours, the sacrifices, the careful way I handled money and responsibility. But somewhere along the way, they learned the wrong lesson. They saw what I had instead of how I got it. And I have to be honest with myself about that, because a man who spent 37 years educating other people's children has no business pretending he played no part in what his own sons became. I gave them too much and asked too little. I confused providing with parenting. That's a hard thing to sit with, but sitting with hard things honestly is the only way through them. What Patsy did, holding my hand on that kitchen floor, stocking my refrigerator, showing up without being asked, that came from character, not from obligation, not from inheritance, from the kind of decency that gets built slowly, through small choices, over years. You can't buy it, and you can't leave it to someone in a will. It either gets developed or it doesn't. Franklin and Curtis were capable of it. I believe that. Curtis, sitting at my kitchen table, unable to look me in the eye, was proof that somewhere in him the recognition was still alive. But recognition isn't the same as growth, and I was no longer willing to confuse the two. The thing about a stroke is that it clarifies. When the words won't come and your hand won't close right and you're lying there alone at 68 years old, the noise drops away and you're left with what's actually real. What was real was that I had spent decades being useful to everyone around me and had somehow, quietly, stopped requiring anything of the people I loved most. That's not generosity. That's a failure of standards. And the consequence of lowering your standards for someone is that they eventually become the person you allowed them to be. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it took a stroke and 4 days alone in a hospital bed to teach me something I should have understood a long time ago, that real love has a spine. It shows up. It tells the truth. It holds people to something. The foundation bearing Margaret's name isn't just a gift to strangers. It's the thing I should have been building all along. Something that asks something of people, that requires them to work and grow and earn what they receive. I'm still my son's father. That doesn't go away. But I am also, finally, fully my own man. And I intend to stay that way.